Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Cody Cassidy, and I am the Outreach and Accounting Associate here at GuideStar. We are thrilled to have you all join us today to discuss nonprofit executive compensation. We know this is always a timely topic and represents a sometimes significant challenge for those of you working in nonprofits. We hope today's event will be helpful and shed some much-needed light on this topic for you. Before we begin, though, I want to go over a few logistics regarding the structure of today's event. As you all noticed when registering for the event, we asked for any and all questions you had regarding nonprofit executive compensation. Our speaker today, Matt Journey, has been hard at work reading through your questions and has grouped them around common themes with the hopes of answering as many of your questions as possible. That being said, we've also blocked off some time at the end of today's presentation to answer more of your questions. To submit a question, simply drop it in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. And I have just, apologies, hang on one second. I am sending out a question in that chat box that you should be able to see in just a moment. Apologize for the confusion here. Great, and so you should see that message. That's where you drop in your questions if you have any along the way, and as I said, we'll get to as many as we can at the close of today's presentation. And next, we are recording today's presentation, so rest easy. If you missed a point or forgot to jot down a note, you'll receive an email with links to today's presentation and slides within just a few days. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Matt Journey of Venable LLP. Matt currently serves as counsel at Venable and the Nonprofit Organizations and Associations Practice Group, where he provides counsel to trade and professional associations, public charities, private foundations, and many other nonprofits on a variety of issues, including executive compensation. In addition to his work at Venable, Matt has also worked as both a regulator and a tax consultant in the nonprofit community. So all of that to say, we are in great hands today as we learn more about this complex matter. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Cody. The real purpose of the presentation today is just to answer your questions and the issues that you're seeing come up in your own organizations so that you have an understanding of how executive compensation is an issue for you or how it's not an issue based on how things are going. I'm going to do this by first providing some background information about executive compensation issues that are unique to exempt organizations. One of the most common questions was, or issues was just people wanting an overview of executive compensation issues. So that'll provide that. I also want to provide some context for addressing your questions. The next part of that, in addition to sort of raising the problems, is to talk about how organizations can address their problems and protect themselves. And the final part will be to answer the questions. The goal is to really answer as many of your questions as possible. So while there's probably about 25 or 30 slides on the background and how organizations protect themselves, I'm going to try to apply through those as quickly as possible. I just wanted you to have this information available to you so that in the future, as you have questions, you have a place to refer back to find things. So what's unique about exempt organizations is that executive compensation is limited by law. So that's different from taxable organizations. There's also disclosure requirements, meaning that organizations are not just subject to enforcement actions or regulation or review by the government entities and regulators, but also by the media and individuals who just have a curiosity about executive compensation. So those two issues make it more difficult for exempt organizations or create problems or potential problems for exempt organizations when it comes to executive compensation. Then there's this third issue, sort of the public expectation. The public expects exempt organizations to be better than taxable organizations. And so when it comes to executive compensation, the public expects organizations to pay less to executives, exempt organizations pay less to executives than for-profit organizations. But starting with the legal risks, there are three general risks for organizations. First, there's the issue of private benefit, which can result in revocation, and private inurement, which can result in revocation. And then for 501c3 and 501c4 organizations specifically, there's also the risk of monetary penalties, both for the individual who receives the excessive benefit and then also for the board members who approve the excessive benefit. And so one of the questions that I got was, is compensation an issue that is as important for taxable entities as, or for C3s as it is for other types of 501c organizations, C5s, 6s, 7s, whatever? And the answer is, to some extent, yes. Revocation is a potential issue for 501c6 organizations and others, but in another sense, it isn't as important because the intermediate sanctions, the monetary penalties that are imposed on executives and the board, are not applicable to C6s. They're only applicable to C3s and C4s. But starting off with inurement, inurement basically is part of the code where no part of an organization's net assets can inure to the benefit of a private individual shareholder. So there's a couple of issues with this. First, you're looking at an insider, an individual who controls the organization or has the authority to control the organization. Board members would generally be considered this. Members for membership organizations would be considered insiders, and the top executives would be considered insiders. So if there is inurement, if there is a situation where an organization's assets or earnings are going to the benefit of a specific individual that is an insider, the only penalty available to the IRS is revocation. And so while this is a very small group of people it's applicable to, even like $1 of inurement, I don't know how you would say $1, but even a minuscule amount of inurement would be grounds for revocation. Where inurement has generally taken place is where a founder of the organization or the chief executive of the organization is able to use the organization as their own sort of piggy bank. And that's not to say that they were excessively compensated in any way, but that there was no limits or restrictions on how they used the organization's earnings. They had sort of a broad discretion to use the earnings to pay for their own private expenses, whether it's travel or a car or whatever, and there was no oversight over that. So there are situations where the IRS has taken a position that there was inurement, even when there was no evidence that the amount of the compensation or the amount of the benefit that inured to the individual was excessive. And so that's an important concept. So while it is a very narrow group of people that's subject to inurement, it is an issue that, one, automatically results in revocation, and two, even $1 of inurement or whatever the minimum amount is sufficient. Private benefit is another big issue, and it's a big and somewhat confusing issue. Private benefit looks to requires that an organization's purpose for engaging in any activity is to serve the public rather than benefit an individual. Because it's any individual that can be benefited, this isn't the same insiders, it's not officers or executives. It is private benefit is applicable to anyone. In fact, the Republican Party was a beneficiary for an organization that was revoked in a situation where the Republican Party was not in any way officially affiliated with the organization whose exempt status was revoked. So though the Republican Party was entirely independent, the court said that the organization was engaged in activities for the purpose of benefiting the Republicans. And so this becomes an important issue where you don't see it as much with the compensation, unless there are all sorts of compensation issues, but you often see this in situations where an organization is set up to benefit the founder or the founder's family. And so it incurs expenses on behalf of the founder's family. Its operations necessarily result in benefits. And while compensation be a part of that, compensation is not necessarily the full amount. So the final big risk is intermediate sanctions. And once again, this is the one that only applies to 501c3 and 501c4 organizations. Intermediate sanctions is under Code Section 4958 was the IRS or the Congress's attempt to remedy the problems of private inurement. As I said, the only penalty for private inurement is revocation. So you'd have a situation where there was inurement, the founder of an organization received substantial benefits from the organization, and then the IRS would come in, revoke the organization's exempt status, and the founder of the, or the beneficiary of the organization's activities, the one who is really the person that did the wrong, was able to get off and not have any repercussions at all. This was especially problematic in situations where the organization identified an issue, got rid of that person who was the bad actor, tried to amend its ways, but the IRS came in and said, there's inurement, we have to revoke you, and then you have a good organization being revoked and a bad individual getting off without any problems. So what inurement, the intermediate sanctions were created to do is to penalize an individual who controls, a disqualified person, a person who controls the organization's activities or an aspect of the organization's activities, such as the founder, the CEO, certain donors that have our large donor advised funds with respect to certain donors, and family members of the founder as well. So there's a group of people that are disqualified persons, and if they receive a benefit, then what happens is you obviously the benefit and compensation and payment for services. If they receive a benefit that exceeds fair market value, then the IRS can penalize that person by charging a 25% excise tax on the value, the excessive amount of the value that they received. And in addition to that, they can require the individual to repay the organization the excess amount of the benefit. If the person doesn't pay back the benefit, and by the time the IRS issues a notice of deficiency, the IRS can assess a second 200% penalty on the value of the excessive benefit. So the easiest way to do this is, let's say there's an organization and the CEO receives $8. The IRS comes in and says $4 was reasonable compensation for the CEO services. What the IRS can do then is say, CEO, you received an excess amount of $4, you owe us $1, and you have to pay back the organization $4. So at that point, the CEO will have received $8, paid $5 to the IRS and the organization. If the CEO doesn't repay that amount, then the IRS will say, okay, CEO, you pay us $1 for that first penalty, and in addition to that, you pay us $8 because of the 200% penalty. So in that situation, the CEO earns $9 and then pays taxes in the amount of, earns $8 and pays taxes in the amount of $9. So the intermediate sanction penalties are very significant for the individual who receives the benefit. So it becomes important for executives to understand their compensation, how that compensation, the reasonableness of that compensation in determining whether or not they want the excessive amount or the additional amount. In addition to penalties on the individuals that receive the benefit, the IRS can tax organization managers who participate in the transaction that caused the benefit. So participation would be for the board members, any board member who voted in favor of it, knowingly participate, I'm sorry. Any board member who knowingly approved it, said that I know this is excessive, but I approve it anyway, so that you get this money. Or even the accepts the amount themselves, the IRS has done that. The penalty on that is is 10% of the excess amount of the tax. So on the $4 penalty, it'd be 40 cents. And so what you have there is, it's capped at 20,000, is joint and several. These are important issues for organizations because if you are outside counsel to an organization or tax counsel to an organization and the executive and the board end up having to pay excise taxes on compensation you didn't tell them was an issue, then you're not going to be representing them. And if you're inside the organization, you're working with the organization, or if you're the executive yourself, these are also very important issues to know because you don't want to knowingly participate in this so that you cause yourself to be liable to this, and you don't want to accept a benefit that causes the amount that causes you to be subject to additional taxes, so that you actually pay more taxes than income that you earned even. This becomes an especially important issue for exempt organizations because unlike taxable entities, exempt organizations' tax returns are all subject to public disclosure. So the Form 990, which requires a lot more information than a typical tax return, is available to the public. And so there's a lot of information about compensation that's paid to individuals, directors, trustees, the key employees, highly compensated officers, amount paid to the five highest independent contractors, and a lot of information not only regarding the amount that's paid, but also the process used to approve the transaction. There's questions in the 990 regarding whether or not the board approves this, whether or not the organization has a written conflict of interest policy, whether or not the organization has a written compensation policy, whether the compensation policy follows, what we'll talk about later, the rebuttable presumption of reasonableness. All questions that lead the reader to understand, one, how much is being paid, and how much oversight is being exerted by the board in determining whether the amount being paid is reasonable. So the fact that this information is all available to the public creates additional issues for organizations, because regulators, donors and members and the media, employees, and even potential new hires are able to look at all of this. And each of those individuals and each of those groups of individuals are looking at this with a very different perspective. The regulators want to make sure you're following the law. The donors want to focus on making donations where their dollar's going to go the furthest. So if you are competing with another organization that's doing a similar thing and you're competing for donors, that competition may cause the other organization to point to the amounts that you're paying executives and the amounts that they're paying executives and say, look, we're putting more of our dollars to this use that you want. And so it becomes an issue with competition. The media is always looking for a story. Employees are often curious about what the executives make and comparing their own salaries. And then also potential targets may look at this and decide whether or not to apply for a position with your organization even before getting to, without you ever getting a chance to put your best foot forward and offer a different amount. So this just talks more about what the organization's individuals are different looking for. I also wanted, this slide doesn't really fit in here, but I wanted to add one slide at least on the risks of undercompensating executives, because there's a lot of discussion so far about the risk of overcompensation, but there are risks to undercompensating too. When you undercompensate, you're not going to keep the people that you want. The organizations that pay more will attract more applicants and be able to retain people better. It may hurt your organization in sort of hiring the best and most qualified people. So there are other potential issues as well, and so compensation isn't just an issue where the organization needs to not pay very much, but it's something that the organization needs to consider from all aspects. And so while there are lots of risks, there's also a way to protect yourselves. The best way to protect yourself is use caution when entering transactions with disqualified persons, with executives, with the board, with corporations and entities that are controlled by executives on the board. Develop policies and effective governance regarding how these things, a good conflict of interest policy, a good compensation approval policy. By having a policy in place and by following the policy, you are going to engage in steps in a process where the board is going to be well aware of everything that's happening at the time. And finally, the most important part is to establish a rebuttable presumption of reasonableness, which is provided by the regulations. And the rebuttable presumption of reasonableness basically says that if an organization does three things: it engages in approves a transaction in advance with disinterested members of the organization's governing body, the governing body obtains and relies on comparability data when approving the transaction, and the governing body documents its transaction or its motivations for its decision. If the governing body does all this before entering into a transaction, before making a payment of compensation, before signing an agreement with the executive, if it does all of that, then there will be a presumption that can be rebutted by the IRS, but there will be a presumption that the amount of compensation was reasonable. And so breaking down into parts, the first part is authorized body of disinterested individuals. It's either the governing board itself or any committee that's permitted by state law to act on behalf of the governing board. Disinterested individuals are anyone who doesn't receive a direct economic benefit from the transaction. So if you have a good conflict of interest policy that's enforced, there will be no everyone who approves the transaction will be the disinterested individual. That's why it's important to have that policy. And finally, the transaction needs to be approved in advance of payment, and but advance doesn't really need to be defined, I don't think. The next step is what is appropriate comparability data, and we're going to get into this a little bit more when I deal with the questions, because there are a lot of questions about this. But a lot of the questions that I saw were do you need a third-party compensation or valuation report? And that depends. Do you need to consider comparability data at all? And the answer is yes, you need to at least find something that's comparable. And finally, the question is, what is comparable? And the way the IRS has defined this is amounts paid by similarly situated organization for a similar position. And you look at size of the organizations, the budget, the location, the activities. You can include both taxable and exempt organizations, so the IRS is always more skeptical of taxable organizations. Another thing, it's always, from an organizational standpoint, it's easiest, also most expensive, to have a third-party person prepare this for you. Another thing that can be compared are actual written offers made by competing organizations. That shows the market value and what individuals are worth. Where can you get the comparability data? Organizations, Forms 990s, all provide the same information that you're going to be reporting. They provide it by title, by position, by title. They show the amount of hours worked. You don't have all the information you need. You don't know the full scope of responsibilities, but you can take the information from the 990. You can say, well, first of all, you know your competitors are, so you can look at their 990s, but then you can also sort of find the 990s for organizations that are of comparable size, engaged in a similar activity, and get an idea of what people in certain positions are making. For smaller organizations, and this was a concern raised in several of the questions, there's a special rule provided in the regulations that said that if an organization has less than $1 million in gross receipts, the organization will be deemed to satisfy the requirement for comparability data if it obtains data from at least 3 similar organizations. And that is very useful for smaller organizations. If you can identify 3 organizations that are similar to you or that you would like to be like even, you can take those organizations and use those as the organizations. You can just pull the 990s and demonstrate in the board minutes that you looked at those 3 990s and you're good to go. The final issue is the concurrent documentation. There were a couple questions on this as well. Concurrent documentation is really simple. It's just the documentation that, one, in the board minutes where the board approved the compensation, the board needs to identify that it did so. So anytime you do that in your board minutes, the next meeting you approve the minutes. Once you approve those minutes where the board said, yes, we looked at the compensation, this is the amount that we approved, you've satisfied the concurrent documentation requirement. In addition to that, it's always helpful that the minutes talk about the reason that this was approved and include any documentation as attachments to the minutes related to the information that was used to approve the data, whether the comparability of the copies of the 990s are approved, or at least listing of the organization names. By establishing the rebuttable presumption of reasonableness, you're really doing your organization a favor. First, the presumption is technically rebuttable, but in all of my work with the IRS, I have never seen the IRS rebut the presumption. even in situations where the IRS probably had a good case. One situation that comes to mind, an individual, the organization received a independent report on the comparability of salaries for an individual, and the organization looked at the report and said, our CEO is better than the people in this report, so we're going to pay at the 95th percentile. And in their board minutes, they said why. They said he built the organization from nothing. He's been there for the duration of the organization's life. He has, in some sense, served in every capacity for the organization, everything from sweeping the floors to acting as the CEO. And he had a unique understanding of the industry. And so based on all of that information, the board said, our guy is better than the 75th percentile, better than the 50th percentile. Our guy needs to be paid at a higher amount than that. And so they paid him the 95th percentile. And the IRS during examination came in and questioned that, and they actually had referred his this issue to a specialist, a specialized group in Cleveland, to look at this to say whether or not the IRS had a case here, whether or not they should go after this for excessive compensation. The IRS said no, that they don't. So, as I said, we've never seen the IRS rebut the rebuttable presumption, even when the compensation is paid at the 95th percentile of the valuation report that the organization received. In addition to protecting the individual who receives the compensation, it also provides the board with a near absolute protection from the excise tax. The requirement for the board tax, or the participation tax, is that the board knowingly engages in an excess benefit transaction. And so if the board has any information that shows that this is not an excess benefit, and the board states that they relied on that in their minutes, that means that the board is protected from ever having knowingly engaged in an excess benefit transaction. The board can point to the information that it used to determine compensation and say, look, based on this information, I did not know this was excessive. So it's near absolute protection for that. Also, just the nature of the process itself, gathering data, reviewing data, having a lot of people that are invested in the organization, have a duty to the organization, weigh in on the process and the amount that's being paid, is something that by its nature reduces the risk that there will be excessive compensation. So that's all very good, and in addition to that, it is something that when you have this process in place and you have questions from the media or you have questions from individual donors, why are you paying this amount? How is this appropriate? By having this process in place, you have data that supports your decision, and you've got information to provide to those individuals or an explanation to tell those individuals so that you are in the best position to address any concerns from non-regulators as they come up. So the issues with not engaged or establishing a rebuttable presumption, technically there are none. There's no requirement that organizations establish rebuttable presumption, and the regulations definitely actually say that if you don't establish rebuttable presumption, it doesn't imply that your compensation was excessive. It's just you didn't establish a presumption. The IRS often takes the position that that's not the case, and takes the position that if an organization doesn't establish rebuttable presumption, the compensation is excessive. So that's something you need to worry about, but technically, from a legal perspective, the IRS is wrong. But that's not a lot of comfort when the IRS is going after you, even though they're wrong. So moving on to the questions. As Cody mentioned at the beginning, there were almost 200 questions. So there's a lot of questions. I can't get to all of them. And there's a lot of questions that were asked that I don't have the ability to answer. I'm an attorney who works with exempt organizations. I'm not a valuation or a compensation consultant. So I don't have information regarding specific salaries. And it would not be good for you or for me if I were to advise you as to whether or not a specific amount was an appropriate or reasonable amount to be paid. I can just tell you how to protect yourself and work with the compensation consultant if you have one. But I do want to make that clear. So the first question that always comes up, especially after I go through all the risks, organizations and individuals get scared, and boards that are on calls like this or boards I talk to, after I talk about the risks, say, well, okay, we're not paying anything. So the question is it okay to pay executive compensation? And the answer is an absolute yes. It is fine to pay. And it's fine to pay substantial amounts because there are lots of charities that do that. There are lots of exempt organizations that do that. You want to attract the best talent. So the issue isn't whether or not you can pay or can't pay. It's whether or not you're paying a reasonable amount. So another issue is small organizations that have not historically paid. Is there going to be an issue if they start paying their executives? No, there's not going to be an issue. It's understandable that at some point organizations, as they grow, will get to the size where they need to have paid professional staff. That is a business decision. The IRS doesn't have the authority to tell exempt organizations how to run their business. It only has authority to decide whether or not the business is being run in an exempt manner. And so when is it okay to start paying officers? If you haven't paid officers before, can you do it in the future? Yes, you can, and it is okay to do it when you decide that it becomes necessary. One of the questions that was asked was if a prior executive was paid below fair market for many, many years, and they didn't take a raise for, I think it was 17 years, and they hire a new executive in that position. Is it going to be a problem if they paid the new executive fair market, even though the old executive was getting paid much, much, much less than that because they hadn't taken a raise? And the answer is it's perfectly fine to do that. It is fine to pay a reasonable amount of compensation for the services that are rendered. Now, a big jump in compensation may jump out at the IRS, but as long as you establish that the amount is reasonable, then you will be in a position to defend yourself, and the IRS understands that individuals get paid higher rates, and they understand that what was reasonable 17 years ago isn't reasonable today. It's a drastic undercompensation. There are actually a couple questions about how an organization can assist an individual who has for years been undercompensated but is now getting to the point where they are nearing retirement and they're not going to be working and they haven't saved anything because they've been undercompensated. How can the organization help that? And that's actually an interesting question that I've seen come up in my practice several times. And you can do this, but you need to be very careful about it. You don't want to take an individual in one position and jack up their salary really high for the last 3 years of their employment so that their salary for those 3 years is excessive without explaining why this is being done. It's important to have this in the board minutes, and it's important to have this as a factor in making a decision. And it's also important to, if you're in a situation like that, where I usually say, you know, it depends on whether or not you want to bring in an expert to do a valuation report. It depends if you want to bring someone in to help you how to structure compensation. It's all your call. In those situations, I almost always recommend that you do go out and hire a valuation expert. Hire someone who is reputable and very creative and will work with you to accomplish the goals that you have. Because for an individual who's been so invested in an organization for so long, you do want to protect them. You do want to help them out. And they have earned that right to be helped out by the organization because they've helped the organization through so much. But you need to be careful about how you do it. And so that's what I'd like you to focus on, and what that's important. Another question that I got that is actually a really good question, and there are several similar questions to it, is what is compensation? I mean, it's obvious that base compensation is included in the definition of compensation, but generally the IRS considers any amount of value provided to an individual as compensation, with the exception being the general non-taxable benefits, such as health insurance and stuff. The stuff that's in the 990 is not being taxable. That stuff usually isn't included, but I'll get to that in a minute. So amounts paid as bonuses, that needs to be considered as part of compensation when approving this. Deferred compensation, that needs to be included in this. Just because the contract says we're not paying you the full $10 on day one, that doesn't mean that the full $10 doesn't need to be considered. Miscellaneous fringe benefits, such as the use of cars, social club membership, concert tickets, stuff like that all needs to be considered as part of compensation, and there may be exceptions. Development officers or CEOs that are very involved in certain community activities may need to have a golf club membership or some other social club membership as part of their position. And in those situations, it'll be a job requirement, not necessarily a compensation benefit, because you want that person to have the connections of that social club. But it's still something that you need to be aware of. And finally, spousal travel is definitely something that needs to be considered. If you're paying for the spouse of an individual who is the executive to travel with them everywhere, then that should be considered. You should issue a 1099 to that spouse as well, just so that you're protecting yourself and the organization. Now, with all that in mind, the next question is, should organizations avoid providing incentive compensation to individuals? Should they just stick to the base compensation? And the answer is not necessarily. The most important part of this presentation is this. I'm a Chicago Bears fan. The Chicago Bears are named the Chicago Bears because when the Bears were founded, the Bears played at Wrigley Field, which is owned by the Cubs. The Bears couldn't afford to rent Wrigley Field during the football season to play games there. So the Cubs said, give us X proportion of the gate, so that way you can afford what you're paying us, and you get a place to stay, and we get extra revenue. And the reason the Bears are named the Bears is because George Halas was forever indebted to the Cubs because they let him do this. Incentive compensation and fee sharing arrangements and expense sharing arrangements, those are all ways that organizations can reduce expenses and only pay for the things that the benefits that they're getting. So yes, this is possible and it's good to do. The issue is that you need to make sure that you're not overcompensating. So when you do this, when you set up a fee sharing arrangement or a incentive compensation, that there are several very important things to do. One, for commissions and fee sharing arrangements, they should never be uncapped. There always has to be a hard cap. That hard cap can be a very, very high number, but there always has to be a cap, because if there's no cap, the IRS will take the position that the purpose of it is to benefit the individual. The other part of this is the board needs to approve prior to payment, both at the start of the contract, the fee share arrangement itself, whether it's 3% or 10% or whatever, or 50%, and then also approve the amount being paid. That protects the organization both on the front of we're not paying an excessive amount and the agreement that we're entering into is reasonable. And just to reemphasize that at the last bullet, is it ever okay to enter into uncapped fee sharing arrangement? And the answer is no, because they always must be a cap. And you must determine that the share is reasonable and the amount being paid is reasonable. It's very, very important. So the benchmark data. How much is too much? What is reasonable? It depends. Is there a table out there for all organizations? The answer is no. I wish there was. There are lots of questions about what's the average salary for Texas, Ohio, Virginia, Montana, wherever. I don't know the answer to this question, and it's not informative, because reasonableness is not based on what the average for your state is. It's based on much more than that. There's lots of questions regarding what exactly is reasonable and what is out there. There is no guide, there's no rule of thumb that says if your revenue is X or your operating budget is Y, you should be paying this amount. There just is nothing out there. What is reasonable is the amount that a willing buyer and a willing seller would transact for, if they both know all of the if they have a reasonable knowledge of all of the facts. Courts have held that the willing buyer, willing seller standard is based on all of the unique facts and circumstances of a particular situation. There's good and bad to this. The bad of this is that it's impossible to have a table that says all organizations can use this amount to determine what's reasonable. There's no safe harbor. $10 salary for one position may be reasonable. For another position, it may be too low, and for another position, it may be excessive. There's never going to be a table for this. There's no single rule of thumb that says if you have a budget of this amount, salary should be X amount for your executives. We can't do that because every organization is different, every area is different, every industry is different. And then finally, once again, that average for the geographic region, that's going to be irrelevant as well, because a hospital that's located 2 doors down from an animal shelter will pay compensation at very different rates, and those rates, though different, even though they're both exempt, could be reasonable. But there's also good to this, and the good to this is that a determination of what's reasonable for one person won't limit or inflate the salaries that you're going to pay your own executive, or as an executive you're going to receive. That decision is made by you. Almost any amount of compensation is reasonable as long as it's done within reason. Executive salaries can be justified, and you just have to put all of the facts into why the decision was made and the grounds for that decision. If you have all of that information, you're forcing the IRS to come and decide how the business should be run as a business, and not whether the compensation is reasonable based on the facts and circumstances. Some of the factors to consider: responsibilities, location. As I said before, written offers for employment for the individual, the size of the organization, prior success of the individual's tenure. The only thing that's really not would be gender and race are not appropriate factors to consider when determining compensation, and that is important to understand. If the IRS is ever, you're under exam and the IRS ever says that as a woman this executive should be earning less, call me. I will represent you for free, because that would just be a fun fight to pick, because the IRS was absolutely wrong in that situation. So the question is, what is reasonable? I just told you that reasonable is whatever it is, and that is both comforting and reassuring, because you can justify reasonable, but it's also very difficult. Two experts will say reasonable for the same person is different. That's possible. There's no set amount that's reasonable. The only way to really establish what is reasonable is to establish a rebuttable presumption, and that's what's the most important thing. And so when we're establishing the rebuttable presumption, what do you use for the benchmarking data? You can look at Form 990. You can look at published compensation surveys. You can look at online tools such as the one the GuideStar has. There's lots of different ways to do this. You can also hire an independent expert. Do you have to hire an independent expert? No, not in every situation. If you do these other things, if you look at 990s, if you look at compensation surveys, and you say, wait a second, at best we're paying at the 25th percentile, then it would just be a waste of time and money to hire an expert to come in and tell you you're paying low. If you look at these other available resources and you say, wait a second, we're paying around the 75th or 80th percentile, that's when you want to have an expert come in and give you their own opinion about what's being done. And so you have the best information available so that you can do this. And also, don't just hire an expert when you're worried you're paying too much. The survey or evaluation report can be used for many reasons. One reason is an organization I worked with recently wanted to pay less to individuals. And what they did was they hired a notoriously lowball expert to come in and provide a valuation report. Then they went to the executives in the negotiation of the contract, said, hey, executives, I'd really like to pay you $1 billion, but this report says I can only pay you 50. I'm sorry, the law's the law. I wish I could pay you more. And that is used as an effective negotiation tactic. Similarly, I've worked with individuals who were executives of organizations who hired consultants to go back to their employer and say, look, you can pay me X dollars more than you are, and we're all good. So that using negotiations that way as well. Dealing with changes. One of the questions was, can executive compensation increase or decrease, or does it need to stay the same even as things change? And the answer is, as things change, the compensation should change as well. If you're subject to a long-term employment contract, you have to pay the contract, but if you're renegotiating the contract and the organization is half the size it was when you entered into the first agreement, the payment should be reduced as well, probably. There are other factors to consider, but it probably should be reduced as well. You can also use your compensation to follow your own strategic growth strategy. You can do that by having incentive compensation. It provides a great deal of flexibility. Also, short-term contracts that aren't automatically extended, where you only have a year contract and every year it needs to be reapproved. That also, while doesn't provide much stability necessarily for the executive, does allow the organization to constantly revisit whether or not the compensation is reasonable and whether or not it needs to be increased or decreased based on how the growth strategy is going. How can organizations adjust for the cost of living? The easiest way to do that is looking at the Social Security Administration's website. The Social Security Administration publishes the cost of living adjustments every year. That shows you sort of where you are in terms of, the cost of living went up 4% this year, you're only paying 3%. That may need to be considered when dealing with future contracts. There are also a couple questions related to regional differences. When I'm dealing with regional differences, I look at the Office of Personnel Management's published pay scale. That's the same pay scale that the IRS is paid on, and they publish a general pay scale and then a locality pay rate that is adjusted by percentage so that people in Boise are being paid one amount and people in New York are being paid a different adjusted amount. That's not perfect. If you have an expert, I would listen to what the expert tells you and not follow that necessarily. But at the same time, it is sufficient if the IRS shows up to say, yes, we did it based on this, because you're using the same information that the IRS does. There was a question about staff located throughout the country. The two issues with that are, one, first of all, you need to understand that staff salaries may not be subject to intermediate sanctions or inurement because they may not have the necessary control of the organization. So you may not have to worry about it from that perspective, but just from a general organization perspective, I would use, once again, the OPM pay scales in doing that. There were questions about inability to pay. If the organization has an inability to pay and the CEO or whatever executive has agreed to forego payment for 3 or 4 months out of the year, and then the next year the question is, can they receive those 4 months of payment in addition to their regular salary when times are better? And that's not a problem. There was an agreement, there's a contract. I would make sure that anything's in writing, though, because every time I've seen this in practice where it wasn't in writing and the IRS did show up, the IRS eventually conceded the issue. But the IRS put up a big fight in doing so beforehand, where if there's an agreement in writing that just says, hey, look, as a bridge loan, I'm not going to get paid this amount, but you do owe me the $10 you would have paid me on this date. When that payment is made, it's not paid as compensation, it's paid as fulfillment of the debt. So yes, it's possible to do. It's just important to do it properly. Red flags, and I'm going to just try to go through really quick some overtime, and I apologize. The red flags are when the benefits and compensation is approved without using the proper process. That's a red flag. When there's a huge jump where one individual is making $10 in year 1 and $1 million in year 2, unless it was they were an interim basis or only served for 2 days in year 1, when there's a big jump like that, the IRS notices. As I mentioned before, uncapped bonuses and incentives and commissions, all things that are the IRS pays attention to and doesn't like. Any truly unique and extravagant benefits, anything that is beyond a prize on Price is Right, charter private planes, travel to exotic destinations, those are all things that raise concerns. Now, there are exceptions. If you are a geological organization and you're looking at volcanoes in Hawaii, it's obvious that you're going to go to Hawaii. That's not the same as you are an organization in, I don't know, Bismarck, North Dakota, and you have your board meeting every December or every January for 2 weeks in Tahiti. that's a different thing. Another issue is any benefit that is not sort of a G-rated benefit or PG-rated benefit is a potential risk. And that's just because when the media looks at these things, the media wants the most interesting issue for the masses. So if there are situations where organizations have found themselves under a lot of media attention for paying for trips to strip clubs or similar establishments, and in those situations, there's a lot of attention, there's a lot of media presence, and there's a lot of trouble because when the media is there, the IRS shows up. And so you never want to be that. So make sure your benefits all have that sort of G rating. I apologize for going long, but where can you get the data? This is really important. You really got to look at sort of the online tools that are available, the Forms 990, the published reports, the independent consultants. That's where you're going to find the most information. And I'm going to now pass this on to Kirsten. And Kirsten, I apologize for going on so long.
Thank you, Matt, and no worries. That was incredibly interesting. It was great to hear your insights regarding nonprofit executive compensation. And for everyone else who's tuned in today, thank you so much. It's great to have you. I'm Kirsten Fraley, and I'm the Director of Data Science here at GuideStar. I'm going to speak to you briefly about GuideStar's annual compensation report. Every year, GuideStar dives deep into the current trends in the nonprofit compensation. For 16 years now, Chuck McLean has headed off our efforts. He's our Senior Research Fellow, a founding employee here at GuideStar, and has been a leading force in compensation transparency. We produce this report to promote transparency in the sector and to enable nonprofits to set fair and appropriate compensation for its employees. In the case of an IRS audit, the compensation report provides justification and support for executive pay that is aligned with the report. The report is compiled from the most recent fiscal year Form 990 data. Now, the IRS Form 990 is the annual tax filing required of sufficiently large tax-exempt organizations. It provides data, and it is the most detailed, reliable source of executive compensation for the sector. The 16th edition of the GuideStar Compensation Report was just recently released. It covers over 96,000 tax-exempt organizations and the compensation of their key employees. Every year, we discover new trends and insights while working with this compensation report. For instance, despite the attention it's received in the news and politics over the past 2 years, the gender wage gap is alive and well in the nonprofit sector. The gap in median compensation ranged from 8% to 23%, depending on size of organization. But women are being represented more often at C-level positions. At all organizations with budgets of $1 million or more, the percentage of women CEOs has actually risen. However, women still make up less than a third of CEOs at the same organizations. CEO compensation has also made headlines in recent years. In the nonprofit sector, we see that the median annual raise for CEO compensation has continued to lag behind what it was pre-recession. For the 6% increase has remained under its pre-recession 4%. Washington once again tops this year's list of highest median salary in the top 20 largest metro statistical areas, or MSAs. That's 11 consecutive years that Washington has topped the list. DC was followed by New York, Chicago, and then LA. However, when we adjusted for cost of living, DC was followed by Baltimore, Boston, and Houston. After discussing executive compensation this afternoon with Matt, we found that getting compensation right is all about doing your due diligence. And part of that is matching compensation on your geographic location, your organization's size and type, and generally finding your context. Getting that information can be a lengthy, complicated, and sometimes arduous task. But the good news is that we've already done it for you. I hope you find the compensation report as interesting as we do every year. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Cody, for putting this all together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks, Matt. We do have just a few extra minutes left over that I want to make sure we have a chance to address the additional questions that have been submitted during today's presentation for you, Matt. And one of the really common questions we're getting is just really big picture, who does all of this apply to? So we've been saying nonprofit executives. Is that limited to just a CEO or executive director position? Does it also include COOs, CFOs, and maybe even lower than that, sort of a VP level? Where is the line there, Matt?
That's a good question. Basically, it applies to all the trustees of an organization, all of the named officers. So the organization's articles or bylaws names what positions are officers, usually secretary, president, or whatever. All those positions, treasurers, are all subject to it. So directors, treasurers, directors and officers, and then the highest compensated employees tend to be included in that. So even if you say our president is this random person who has no control of the organization, and then whatever janitor receives the highest compensation and actually is sort of controlled, though he only holds the title janitor, the IRS will treat the individual with the title janitor as though they are the chief executive for purpose of this. And then in addition to that, you also have any family member of the officers, directors, and people that control the activities of an organization, any individual who is able to exert substantial influence over the activities of the organization, whether it is the largest contractor of the organization or the largest donor of the organization. So it really gets a pretty broad group, but the rule of thumb is you look at your officers and directors, the named officers and directors, the CEO, CFO, and then I would also look at anyone else who could exert influence. And aside from those people, you're generally safe.
Great, great. And then it looks like we're approaching the top of the hour, so I want to be respectful of all of your time. So we'll address just one more question. There were a couple of questions that came in about if the executive or those in that group that you just mentioned, Matt, that are subject to this, what if they are actually employed by their own management company, or they are consultants or sort of something like that? Does that change anything in terms of sort of what the nonprofit needs to go through to establish the compensation there?
In that situation, the organization needs to make sure that the payments to the management company that is paying the individual are all reasonable. Presumably, the organization hires a management company, pays the management company then pays the executive. So in those situations, you need to worry about your contract with the management company, because the management company, if the management company is controlled by the executive, is itself a disqualified person. So payments to the management company would be treated the same as payments to the individual themselves. So it wouldn't necessarily be compensation, because you wouldn't have to worry about, benefits, taxable, non-taxable, whatever other fringe benefits, but you would look at the total amount paid to the management company.
Great, great. Thanks so much, Matt and Kirsten, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you found this as informative as I did. And again, thanks, Matt, for all of that helpful information. For all of you that joined us today, as I mentioned before, you will get an email within a few days with links to Matt's very helpful slides and a recording of today's presentation for you to refer back to as often as you'd like. And in the meantime, please reach out and let us know. I believe, Matt, you were going to share your contact information. That is,
it is on the last slide.
Right there. Great. Yep. So there's Matt's contact information, and I believe the reminders and things came from mine. Thanks again, everybody, and again, Matt and Kirsten. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.